Welcome to Design Build Workshop. Today we're going to go through the entire process of designing and printing and finishing a steam hammer for an HO scale factory. So this is the image I found on Pinterest, and it's of a steam hammer, and for reference there's a child, looks like, operating as some part of it. So that gives me some idea of reference for scale. But I like the design of this one, so this is one we're going to work off of. While we're working on the design of this piece, I'm printing it on the Creality K1 printer. So by the time we're done with all the design stuff, that should be ready to come off the printer and we can start assembling. Hey, please don't forget to go ahead and subscribe to the channel. I would really appreciate it, so you can get more content just like this. Thanks. Okay, so let's start with the design aspect of this. So we're going to go right back to the original sketch. And this will show us kind of how I started. So if you'll notice, all the measurements are off to one side. That's because I designed this as a half. And then once I had the dimensions where I wanted them, I basically mirrored that drawing to the other side. So then I have a whole shape here. With the design software I use, everything has to be restrained. So if you notice, there are measurements associated with the radiuses and the curves and pretty much everything that's in here. So once we got to that point, then we're going to end up, we're going to close this out. And this was what the Boss extrusion looks like. So it was extruded at 0.2, so just under 1/4 of an inch. That was the first initial part of it. And then we're going to go to this. So the next phase is giving it some depth. So what we're going to do here is we're going to leave that very outside edge and then make a cut into the material, so I've got some depth to this piece. And so that's what this ends up looking like. So that gives us essentially that wall right there, all around the outside edge. So the next thing I'm gonna want to do is make another cut. And you can see here in the drawing, I'm cutting this section, this interior part. You can see the black lines here. I'm cutting that section out, or down a little bit further, not quite as deep as this wall. So I have another angle or another relief point. And we'll see what that looks like. So what that did, that gave us this wall right where the rivets are going to rest. Once again, just adding more and more detail. And the next drawing after that, once I have those two pieces in there, now we're going to place all the rivets. Now these are drawn at 0.003, or 0.03. Yeah, sorry, right there. So that's bigger than what, a real rivet would be. I think it's going to end up being like around 4 inches or so. So, we're cheating scale a little bit, but I don't think we're cheating it enough that it looks, completely out of place. So that was the next thing here. Now, instead of making a cut, we're going to do an extrusion, which means I'm going to extrude these pieces here. I'm going to extrude them out. So what that ends up doing is giving us this, right? So those are extruded out at 0.02, so not quite as far out as they are in circumference. And our next piece is this upper piece. Okay, so you can see here originally this was just, just all one piece. So I wanted to make a little bit of a cut into it. We're going to X out of that. And then the next part, sorry, that's the actual cut. right? So I cut that back. And then beyond that, now we have to do another part that we want to do at the top. So to accomplish that piece that was on the top of the steam hammer, essentially the part that's, you know, causes the ram to go up and down, and it's got a room for it. Essentially this piece right here. We need to have that be received by this. So I need to put this radius in here to match this radius. So that's what this drawing is. And then we're going to do an extrude for that. So that's what we did there. And all I did is extrude it to the bottom of where this line would be, right, you know, this line, essentially right here. So once that's done, now I've got to have room for the ram to go, right? So we're making a hole here, or a half hole, essentially. And what that's going to do, that's going to give us the cut through here so that the ram has got somewhere to go. And the last piece that we did was the guide. So because the hammer moves up and down within this, or, you know, I'm calling it the hammer, but the piece that actually comes down on the hot metal, that's got to have a guide to rest between these two halves. And that's what this is. We'll X out of that, and there's your guide. Now that's really thin because this space in here is really thin. So that's basically half of what the cutout is in here. Now, as far as designing this for printing, I wanted this to be a half so that I could get full detail on this face. And if I were to print it in this position and as a whole piece, you know, two halves together, I would lose a lot of this detail of the rivets because the printer could probably handle it, but it wouldn't be anywhere near as clear. So I decided to break this in half and print it flat like this, and then assemble the two halves together. And that gives me basically the main part of the steam hammer. So this is the upper section of the steam hammer. This is the part that actually would contain the ram that would go up and down in the steam hammer to make it function. And if you look over here, you can see there's actually a lot more detail in this piece than there was in the half of the main body. That's because there's a lot going on in here. And so the first thing was basically to design this piece here. So what we did with that, we just did our sketch. Okay. And we just took the measurements off those two halves of the front and back of the steam hammer, and, you know, I knew exactly what those were. So this is what we did. So this is the first step. So once that's done, then we get this first extrusion up to this point, this piece right here. The next part of that is going to be putting that centerpiece in, and that's going to be this. So I've got that round spot there, and that's going to be extruded into this piece. So that was our second step. Next was those supporting kind of like curved pieces are on the outside of this. Essentially it's a casting. And so that's got to get supported, right? We don't want to have this piece just sitting there alone. And plus it matches the photograph, the image that we were working off of. So that gives us, so we start here and we figure out what this is. 0.04 is the width, and the 0.30 is how tall we are. So what we're going to do is we're going to extrude that. And when I extruded that, it went like this. I extruded all the way through to this other side, right? And that's easier because I don't have to do it on both sides of this 3D model. I can just extrude it all the way over to the other side because they're going to be even anyway. So the next thing after that is I have to cut away some of that part we just did. So this is how we did that. Basically, we're going to cut away this section that's contained within this curved triangle, and we mirrored that on the other side. And once we made our cut, we went all the way through. So now we have our support piece in there. Next part, again, rivets. So rivets are really great. I really like doing rivets a lot. They take a lot of time as far as, you know, drawing all these out. There are ways you can do it so it's a lot quicker, which I do, but I'm not going to go into that right now. But you know, the detail of the rivets is one of the things that really makes the detail work for these small scale pieces. And so here you can see where those are drawn out, and then those are just going to get extruded out to 0.02. So like I said, once again, it's 0.03 in its circumference and extruded out 0.02. Once again, those rivets are too big for, you know, if we're actually going to stay true to scale, but I think they're close enough that, you know, it still pulls off well. So then we have this weird little piece on the side over here. And what I did with that is I drew in the center and we extruded that in two directions, if that makes sense. In other words, we used a mid-plane and extruded it out in both ways. And what that does, that gives us that piece. See how I extruded it in both directions? And all we did was just make a block, right? And then so what I want to do then is I want to clean that block up. So we're going to do this. So the next drawing was basically cutting some of this away, right? So this thing doesn't look just like a blob of whatever sitting there. So you can see that's what the effect was. Right? We cut that out there. Now I didn't want this to be just sticking out there, you know, flat, right? So we did fillets. In other words, we put little curves in this thing, right? So I curved this, I curved that section. We curved, like I said, this section here. And then we have to put these pieces in. So what this drawing is, in order for the steam hammer to function, it has to have a positive and a negative, you know, flow, right? For the up and down action of the ram. So we drew these, and these are going to be basically the pipes that function to bring that about. So we have this going down into the base piece here, which, you know, ideally is going into the hammer itself. I realize this is a lot of detail for a small little piece, but you know, the details matter, and the details are what really brings all this kind of stuff to life. So once that's done, then we drew these bottom ones in here too. And then we did one more fillet. In other words, we curved this top edge and we curved this bottom edge so that we just didn't have a square looking thing. Because I looked at the drawing and that's kind of how that looks. Now there is a little more detail in this as far as the original photograph, but you know, I was only going to go but so far. So anyway, this is the top section, and once again, we printed it so this is the part that's going to be on the build plate. And the reason that works is because if you imagine the extruder all going from here up, right? All these details are going to come out really well. The one that's going to be a little bit of trouble is right here, because that's unsupported. Now, that being said, this is a really, really small piece. So when you look at this, it's tiny. And I can do a close-up later, but right here you can see it's a little rough underneath. And that's because the extruder is basically extruding into thin air. But because this is such a small area, it's not going to be affected. If this was really large and say was like an inch across or something, then you're going to have kind of a print that's not going to work out very well. But because that's on the bottom and it's so small, you're not going to have an issue with that. And so that's why this was done this way. And I don't like using supports as much as possible, which is why I break things up a lot. I want to print for detail. I don't want to print for, you know, as far as being expeditious about it. I just want it to come out well. That's where I come from when I'm doing the modeling. Okay, so this is the hammer base. And where's this piece right here? And there's a decent amount of details in here. This one doesn't have as many like radiuses in it or anything. But you know, the first part's going to be this section right here that we have to print out. And all I did then was I took the measurements of the two halves together, figuring out where these went, which they're going to rest, you know, on this top section here, and then I designed the rivets to go around them. And it's very similar to what the image was in the, you know, when we found on Pinterest. So the next part is going to be drawing this smaller piece in the middle. So we've got the base here, but then we want to have a raised section here that's actually going to contain the anvil. So these are the measurements for that. And then the extrusion is actually right here. That was the next part that was extruded up. And I think this is 0.05 as far as the thickness of each of these. So the next step after that was to actually put in the anvil itself. So there's the drawing for that. And then that was extruded. And then the only thing we did beyond extruding this up as one piece, which was like that, just a square, I want to bevel these edges because that's how it is in the drawing as well. Or not drawing, the image that we had. And so that's going to give us this. So we did another drawing where we're going to cut through and form this with a little bit of a taper right there. And this taper is very similar to the hammer section, which actually is the smallest piece that kind of goes up and down in the steam hammer. And then really beyond that, it's just the rivets, right? So we've got that set of rivets, we've got that set of rivets. And then I did put a hole in the center. Okay, so let's talk about that for a second. So originally, I cut a hole up through here, and that's how it's printed. There's still a hole here. And it's done so I could have an LED light come up into this piece. And some of the idea is that I may have like a glowing red light through here. And then I would cut a really small, or drill a really small hole into this space right here to kind of give that a red glow. Still not sure if I'm going to do that yet or not, but anyway, it's designed that way so I can. Now, anytime you do a hole like this and you want it to be fairly clean, one of the things you want to do is you want to basically dome that. So there's a fillet that was designed in this, and you can kind of tell. So if I just did a cylinder, right, and left the top flat, we'd have the same issue that we had with this top piece we were talking about, where the printer would be printing in thin air. So here you can see this is domed. And because of the dome, because it's got an arc, when that printer puts the filament down, it can follow that arc without having a bunch of stuff, you know, loosely printing in the middle of nowhere. So anytime you have like a hole like that, if you can put a dome in the center of it, that's going to help the printing, and you're not going to have to support for that section. Now this is really small, so I probably wouldn't have needed it anyway, but at least it's cleaner. So that's the base. Okay, so last piece of the steam hammer is the hammer itself. So this is the piece that's going to go up and down and smash the hot metal, right? Pretty basic. We're going to start here, right? And we're going to extrude this out. So there you go there. Extruded from the side. So I went from here to here as far as the extrude. Then the next thing is to I made the cuts on this section. So we cut those pieces out so we had that taper. And then we had to do this. So we had to cut through to give, so this is what's going to receive the guide, right? So we were talking about the half, and we've got that little guide section in there. So that's what's going to slot this piece in here. Now that's, I drew these so this is the same thickness, so this is 0.06. The guides were done at 0.03, so half that thickness. The problem is when you have like a 0 thickness between two things, they're not going to fit. So if you design it this way, you're going to have to file out a little bit or remove some of that material so this will still fit. And then the last part was putting this hole in. And so what I did, instead of drawing this with the ram itself in here, which had been 2 or 3 times as tall as this whole piece is, and I just think it had a low possibility of printing, right? Because you've got a tall little skinny piece in there, and the chances of that printing accurately are going to be a problem. Plus, when I did print this, it's printed from this face, right? It's printed this way. So that hole is hollow in the center, so it's printed from the bottom up. So what I did then was I just made this to the point where I could fit a toothpick. So the ram itself is actually made from a toothpick. And that's what's inserted here. It doesn't go anywhere into this piece, but it does go up past this, so you don't see the end of it. And that made things a lot easier. So here's what came off the build plate. And this is what I have as far as the assembly. And I did it this way. So this is the top piece that you can kind of remember from the photo. 1/2. The other half. And then the base. Or for reference, this is the anvil. And then if we're going to kind of put this thing together roughly, we're going to end up with something like that. Okay, so I didn't do a ton of sanding on this, but there is a little bit of a lip on here. So I just got some 220 and I'm sanding those sections just to make sure I get it flat. That's enough. And then there's a little bit of ridging along here. So I'm going to take care of that. That's enough for that. It's not like I need to do a lot of this. And some of this after I glue it together, I may do a little bit more kind of detailing. And I can't do that here because I've got this ridge right here that will prevent me from sanding this way. So I can go ahead and sand that by hand, just trying to get that edge right off of there. And then these are the only 2 pieces that really need to be sanded. As far as before the glue up. And they don't necessarily have to be done before the glue up. I just like to get it done so it's a little smoother. And then I may go take that small edge off. Right, get that. So I don't have any lip. And then we're going to glue these together. Now, like I said before, with the hammer section, where I've got this groove cut here, that's a little too small for the receiver for that groove right here. So I could do one of 2 things. I could go ahead and try to clean that out a little bit and make it a little bit smaller, a little bit thinner, so it would handle, this piece. However, it's a lot easier to take a file once this lip is removed, to take a file and file out that edge right there. So it's a little bit wider, so it'll slip up into that groove. Actually, it goes this way. So that's how I'll do that. As far as the base, really no finishing is required at all. This prints out just fine. I don't need to do anything to it as far as before any kind of painting or primering or anything like that. Same thing with this piece. I didn't need to do any kind of cleanup or anything on this. Printed out just fine. So this can go as is as well. So the first step is going to be gluing these two halves together. I'm a little old school, so I am still using basically plastic model cement. Someday I'll make the transition over to CA glue. But you know, until then, this is what we're using. You don't need a lot. The only thing is, this is going to have to cure just for a little bit. That's probably fine. We're going to put our two halves together. Make sure your seams are lined up. Now, the only difference between assembling stuff with being 3D printed and a model kit, essentially, I built a lot of models when I was a kid, is that a lot of those pieces are indicated. So there will be like a little bit of a bump out with a little bit of a hollow. So when those two pieces come together, or a ridge or a line or something where pieces match up. With 3D printing, because you want the bottom to be flat. If I did put a ridge in there, then it would have to have support and all kinds of other stuff, and I don't want to deal with that. So basically, I just do a pretty decent job of lining these up. And then if something is a little bit off, like here, you can see these two aren't lined up quite right. I want to split that. I want this to be priority over the top. So if the top doesn't match up so well, I'm not too worried about that. It's easier for me to like kind of put this piece on here, and that's going to cover up any kind of discrepancy. And I can go back in and sand the sections around there so it lines up well. But this is probably the most complicated part of putting this together, which is not hard at all. And then, you know, that will go here. This will go there. And then once we trim the hammer, that will go up in there. And then you can set that depending if you want it, you know, a little bit higher or a little bit lower. And that, you know, depending on where we do our toothpick, you just cut a certain length, and then I can have the hammer so it's further up in here or further down or all the way resting on the anvil. So this is the file that I used for opening this piece up or cleaning it out a little bit. It's a knife file, and all I do is get in here and maybe tilt it a little bit in both directions. You do both sides. And that should make it wide enough where it fits in okay. Now, as far as this piece, I'll take that, fit that in there. It's nice and snug. And then all I have to do then is figure out where I want the position of this. So I will just cut this based on where I want that. Probably about right here. And that doesn't need to be clean. You're not going to see it anyway. But when that goes in, and I need to trim this out a little bit more, but that'll go up in there. So it'll be up there, and you won't see the end of that. So to start this off, we're going to do a base coat or a primer coat, if you would want to prefer it that way, of a gray black. So someday I'm actually going to break out the airbrush, but I've never used one before. I own one, but I have not started to use it. So at some point I need to do that, just because I know it'll be a whole lot better with doing this kind of thing. But anyway, we're going to do everything in this undercoat of a gray black, and that's because all of the metallic paints and some of the other stuff will pop a little bit more with this as a base coat. So it doesn't have to be perfect or very smooth or whatever. Just make sure you're getting everything covered. The other thing is, with all the little details that we have in here, it will get in those deeper areas. You want to make sure you cover everything. And then so when you go over it with something else, you're going to leave behind maybe some of that black that the other color doesn't get to, which is only going to give it more depth when you are finally finished. So this is the hammer section. The great thing about the toothpick is it makes a good handhold too when you're painting this. If you're familiar with machine tools, you're going to find two predominant colors. You're going to find a light gray and kind of this weird green color. Don't know really the reason why behind that. I've always assumed that the gray was because of like naval equipment. A lot of that stuff was painted like a light gray, but I don't know if that's necessarily the case. But we're going to paint this one in that green color. And so on this particular piece, I'm not going to do the insides here with the green. I'm only going to do kind of like the outside casing. So it's not going to be, doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. There's going to be chips and there's going to be maybe a little bit of rust. So now that we've got our green done primarily on the main part of the steam hammer, we're going to go ahead and do some detailing. So I want to take the shaft. It's going to be like a pure metal, because it's just going to be steel. I'm going to put that back in frame. And this piece wouldn't be weathered at all, just because of its nature. Constantly moving, working, it'll be oiled all the time. So worst case scenario, it may have a little bit of oil drippage on it, but from hammers that I've worked on, and those were different, those were air hammers, but the shaft itself is never rusted or anything like that. Now I'm getting some of this kind of all over the place. And I'm really just trying to hitch this, but these edges will be fine to hit. And then we'll go back over it again. You can see I'm getting kind of silver paint everywhere. We'll come back over it with some black, like a wash. And that will take care of some of that over coverage. And because this is an active piece of equipment, there's not going to be a ton of rust on it as far as like, you know, the aging process or weathering process. But it is going to have, especially these rivets, constantly being stepped on, scraped over, stuff like that going on with it. It's going to have some wear and tear. Same thing with the anvil itself, but not a ton, because the stuff that it's hammering, you're going to have all kinds of like mill scale coming off, the hot pieces of, or the hot chunk of metal that you've got on here. So it's going to be black for the majority, just because it's got all kinds of leftover stuff on it. So we're going to be a little more gentle with the silver on that. Same thing with the hammer itself. Here, I can touch that. You may have like a little bit of silver coloring in here. Try to get that back in frame. Yeah, that's good. Like I said, not a ton, just slightly. Okay. This is going to be a little more tricky. I'm going to try to dry this out a little bit more. Now the last ones I did, I kind of got it all over the place. So I'm going to try to be a little more careful. Just touching the top edges of the rivets. Like I said, we're going to do a wash in this anyway, probably. But this brings our rivets to life a little bit more. And we're going to hit our edges, because that's what's going to get some abuse, especially on the inside here. Maybe along this part, up here. Bring some on this edge too. And now that our silver is relatively dry, we're going to go ahead and do the final assembly. So this piece, I don't even bother gluing, because it fits in here tight enough. Yeah, that's what we look like when we're in there. And then just gonna glue this. Oop, that's a lot of glue. Let's see, hopefully we don't have a squeeze out issue with that, but I'll probably be okay. Alright, we'll let that dry. I'm going to do some weathering. So now we're going to do a black wash over the whole thing. And so it'll flow a whole lot better. Let's see. This side. Yeah. That's a lot better. Messy, it's fine. Dark right there. Some of those will look like oil. Some of those look like grime. probably a little too, you can see like too many brush strokes in there. So that's not so great. Probably change that around. This side I like, it's decent. I kind of like all this that's going on up here. I like how it's pooled a little bit along those edges. That's good. Give it like an oil, like oil is kind of settled right there. And then this, we're not going to concern ourselves too much with the black wash because this is already black essentially down here. So what we're going to do, we're going to bring out the rust. Even though this is a working piece of machinery, we are going to highlight some areas with rust, especially up here where the steam enters. We'll do that next. So what I've been using for rust is this, what's it called? Cinnamon stick, which seems to work pretty well. So we're just going to do this like a dry brushing technique. And where I'm going to put some is where the steam enters the hammer. We need a little more than that. Be careful here. There we go. And let that kind of drip down. Hit this edge. And that drips down a little bit too. Okay. And I'm going to put a little more. Put some along these outside edges. So like maybe water is built up there a little bit once in a while. Let's cause that to rust a little. That's going to be a lot. Be careful here. You can overdo this pretty easily if you're not. There we go. That's pretty good. Now where main action is happening right in the center here, not going to be a lot of rust, probably a little more, I should probably put a little more silver in there for chipping and wear, because that's where the person's going to be working, where stuff's going to be put, material. Maybe put a little bit in here. Maybe I'll have a little bit of rust higher up because this doesn't get touched all that often, so it's possible that this could get a little rusty. Maybe that a little bit. Maybe some of those rivets. This piece here. Not crazy aggressive. Not getting much on there. Okay, that's a lot. I gotta be careful here. A lot of paint loaded on there. Okay. Maybe some of it stripped down here. And then on the top edge. There's a little up there too. Especially where the paint chipping has happened. A little bit more. There we go. Do some more of this top edge. Black got a little heavy right there. Anyway, that should about do it. So here the steam hammer's in place. I've actually got these glued down to the base. Everything was printed as far as like high detail in most of this, except for the floor, which was basically just like a quick print. I wasn't really concerned about that. I've got some weathering going on here now. I've painted the floor. You know, we've got the puddle furnaces in here, And these are obviously the steam hammers. Thanks again for joining me on Design Build Workshop. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and I hope to see you next time.